3 members of the notorious Shadow Riders motorcycle club stormed into the midnight grill, their heavy boots echoing against worn wooden floors. The smell of leather and menace filled the small roadside diner as they made their way to a counter where a middle-aged cook worked quietly, his weathered hands moving with uncanny precision as he prepared the evening's meals. The bikers couldn't have known that those same hands had earned Rio Suarez the name Silent Blade in the underground, fighting circuits of Southeast Asia, where his knife work was spoken of in whispers by those who survived to tell the tales. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind howled across the Nevada desert, sending tumbleweeds dancing past the windows of the Midnight Grill. Located 50 miles outside of Las Vegas, on a stretch of highway that truckers called the Dead Zone, the small diner served as an oasis for weary travelers and local ranch hands seeking hot coffee and home-cooked meals. Behind the worn counter, Rio Suarez moved with fluid efficiency, his knife sliding through vegetables with mesmerizing precision. Each cut was perfect, each motion economical, though none of his customers would notice anything unusual about the quiet cook who kept the Midnight Grill running. His dark hair had begun graying at the temples, and fine lines around his eyes suggested years of hard living, but his hands remained remarkably steady as he worked. The diner itself was unremarkable at first glance. A dozen worn booths lined the windows, their red vinyl seats patched in places but meticulously clean. The counter featured 8 chrome stools, their bases bolted securely to the floor in a way that seemed ordinary enough. But Rio had chosen every detail of the layout with careful consideration, from the slight angle of the prep station that gave him clear sightlines to all entrances, to the strategic placement of the chrome napkin dispensers that allowed him to monitor blind spots. Sarah Chen, the young waitress who handled the evening shift, watched Rio work as she refilled coffee cups. In the 6 months she'd been employed at the Midnight Grill, she'd noticed things about the cook that didn't quite fit the image of a simple diner employee. The way he positioned himself in the kitchen, always able to see who entered and left. How he tested the weight and balance of each new knife before adding it to his collection. The way his eyes tracked certain customers with predator-like focus while seeming to barely notice others. The diner's location had been carefully chosen, though none of its regular customers knew why. Situated at the intersection of 2 major trucking routes, it provided clear views in all directions across the desert landscape. The nearby hills offered no hiding spots for observers, and the long, straight highway approaches meant no vehicle could arrive unnoticed. To most, it was simply convenient placement for a roadside establishment. To Rio, it was tactical positioning, born of hard-learned lessons. The kitchen itself was Rio's domain, a space he had gradually modified over 3 years to serve purposes beyond food preparation. The knife rack mounted on the wall contained an impressive collection of cooking implements, each one perfectly maintained. But hidden beneath the conventional tools were blades that had nothing to do with food preparation, specimens collected from around the world during his former life, each one balanced and honed to lethal perfection. The evening regulars began filtering in as the sun set behind the western hills. Thomas Green, a long-haul trucker who stopped by 3 times a week, always sat in the same booth with a clear view of his rig in the parking lot. Mary Rodriguez, who ran the local gas station, preferred the counter where she could chat with Sarah while enjoying her usual chicken-fried steak. Each patron had their habits, their preferred seats, their regular orders, patterns that Rio noted and catalogued with the same attention to detail he'd once used to track marks in Bangkok's underground fighting rings. Rio's movements in the kitchen maintained their practiced efficiency as the dinner rush began. Every step, every gesture served multiple purposes. cooking excellent food while maintaining optimal positioning and awareness of his surroundings. The weight of the knife in his hand was familiar, comfortable, though these days he used it only for its intended culinary purpose. Still, old habits die hard, and his grip occasionally shifted to holds that had nothing to do with food preparation. The Midnight Grill's reputation for excellent food and quick service had grown steadily over the years. Travelers spoke of the quiet cook whose steaks were always perfectly prepared, whose home-style meals offered comfort to weary drivers. None of them knew that the same hands that crafted their meals had once moved with such speed and precision that opponents in illegal fighting pits had surrendered at the mere sight of his blade work. Sarah delivered plates with practiced ease, her movements coordinated with Rio's timing in a dance they'd perfected over months of working together. She'd learned to read his subtle signals, a slight pause in his chopping that meat trouble might be brewing, a particular way he positioned himself that suggested she should be extra alert. Though he'd never explained these signs to her directly, her natural intelligence had picked up on their significance. The diner's large windows, which offered such spectacular views of the desert sunset, also served Rio's need for constant surveillance. Regular customers assumed the mirrors mounted in certain corners were simply decorative choices, never noticing how they eliminated blind spots and provided multiple angles on every entrance. The chrome fixtures and polished surfaces throughout the diner all served similar dual purposes, aesthetic choices that doubled as tactical advantages. As the evening wore on, Rio maintained his quiet vigilance while preparing meals with genuine care and skill. His reputation as a cook had been hard-earned and well-deserved. The skills that had once made him legendary in underground fighting circuits translated surprisingly well to culinary arts. The same precision, timing, and attention to detail that had made him deadly now made him an exceptional chef. But beneath his focused exterior, Rio remained acutely aware of his surroundings. The rumble of approaching motorcycles caught his attention long before their headlights swept across the diner's windows. Years of experience had taught him to recognize the sound of trouble arriving, and the distinctive growl of heavily modified Harley-Davidsons set off well-honed warning instincts. His hands never paused in their work, but his awareness shifted to high alert as the roar of engines grew louder. The shadow riders were about to make their first mistake. Local ranch hands who frequented the Midnight Grill often remarked that Rio's knife work was unlike anything they'd ever seen, even in high-end Vegas restaurants. The way he could dice an onion was mesmerizing, his blade moving so fast it seemed to disappear, leaving only perfectly uniform pieces in its wake. What they didn't know was that this same technique had once been used to disarm a Muay Thai champion in a Bangkok basement. The precision of his blade work, leaving the hardened fighter stunned and weaponless in less than 2 seconds. The kitchen's layout reflected Rio's deep understanding of close-quarters combat. The prep stations were positioned to allow rapid movement between them, with clear paths to both the front and back exits. Heavy stainless steel equipment was arranged to provide cover if needed, and the kitchen's single window offered a clear view of the desert highway stretching east. Even the floor mats were chosen for their grip rather than comfort, ensuring stable footing in any situation. Sarah had begun to notice other peculiarities about her employer. The way he tested the acoustic properties of the diner, occasionally dropping a pan or utensil as if by accident, then noting how the sound traveled, how he'd installed additional lighting outside that eliminated potential hiding spots in the parking lot. The fact that he always kept 3 separate phones charged in his office, though she'd never seen him use any of them. The diner's regular customers had developed an unconscious respect for Rio's boundaries. None of them ever attempted to enter the kitchen unannounced, though there was no sign forbidding it. Something in the cook's quiet demeanor, the way he carried himself even while performing the most mundane tasks, suggested boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Thomas Green, between bites of his usual meatloaf dinner, often told stories about the changes he'd observed along his regular route. Recent months had seen an increase in motorcycle gang activity across the region, with several small businesses falling under their protection schemes. The Shadow Riders, in particular, had been expanding their territory, moving out from Las Vegas into the surrounding desert communities. Rio absorbed these stories while maintaining his focused cooking routine, each detail filed away with the same precision he applied to maintaining his knife collection. He knew the patterns of escalating gang activity all too well, had seen similar progressions in territories from Thailand to Brazil. The distant rumble of approaching motorcycles now carried the weight of inevitable confrontation. Mary Rodriguez, picking up on the subtle shift in Rio's demeanor, settled her bill and headed for the door. She'd learned to read the quiet cook's moods over years of regular visits, and something in his stance told her the diner wasn't where she wanted to be for the next hour or so. As she left, she noted how his hands had shifted their grip on the knife he was using, though his cutting rhythm never changed. The sun had fully set now, leaving the desert in darkness broken only by the diner's lights and the distant glow of Las Vegas on the horizon. The approaching motorcycle's headlights carved bright paths through the darkness, their beams sweeping across the diner's windows as they turned into the parking lot. The rumble of their engines filled the space as 3 bikes pulled up, their chrome glinting under the carefully positioned exterior lights. Sarah, wiping down the counter, caught Rio's subtle nod, their practice signal for her to move away from the entrance. She'd never questioned these unspoken warnings. Having seen their value, the night 2 drunk cowboys had tried to cause trouble. Rio had handled that situation with remarkable efficiency, though she still wasn't quite sure exactly what he'd done. The cowboys had simply left very quickly and never returned. The weight of Rio's favorite kitchen knife felt familiar in his hand as he continued preparing the evening's last batch of seasoned potatoes. The blade's balance was perfect, its edge honed to a precision that went far beyond culinary requirements. Like everything else in his carefully constructed world, it served multiple purposes, all of them centered around his twin devotions to preparing excellent food and being prepared for any threat. Time seemed to slow as the diner's door swung open, bringing with it the smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust. Rio's awareness expanded to encompass every detail of his environment, the position of each utensil, the distance to key defensive positions, the location of every potential weapon or obstacle. Years of training had made this heightened state feel as natural as breathing. The Shadow Riders were about to discover why some legends are whispered about in fighting pits across Asia, and why the name Silent Blade still caused hardened fighters to look over their shoulders. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rio Suarez hadn't always been a cook in a desert diner. 20 years earlier, in the sweltering heat of Bangkok, he had earned a reputation that would follow him across continents. The underground fighting circuits of Southeast Asia had given birth to the legend of Silent Blade, a name that still caused old fighters to lower their voices when speaking of past encounters. His journey into that world hadn't been planned. As a young chef working in Singapore's bustling restaurant scene, Rio had dreams of opening his own fusion restaurant, blending his Mexican heritage with Asian culinary traditions. His natural talent with knives had made him a rising star in the kitchen, earning him a position at one of the city's most prestigious establishments. That all changed the night he witnessed a local crime syndicate's enforcers threatening an elderly street vendor outside his restaurant. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as like watching water flow through air. Rio's intervention, using only his chef's knife and moves learned from his grandmother's traditional knife-fighting techniques, left 3 hardened criminals unconscious and a 4th running into the night. The incident caught the attention of Master Chen, a retiring knife-fighting champion who recognized in Rio's movements the rare combination of natural talent and inherited skill. His final conversation with Master Chen took place in the old man's small garden, over a meal they had prepared together. "Your knife skills began in the kitchen," Chen reminded him, watching Rio's precise vegetable cutting. "Perhaps that is where they can find their truest expression." The master's own journey had followed a similar path, from combat to teaching, and finally to seeking peace through simple daily practices. The underground fighting world never knew what became of Silent Blade. His disappearance spawned countless theories and rumors. Some claimed he had been killed by jealous rivals, others that he had become an anonymous government operative. A few even suggested he had achieved such mastery that he had become literally invisible, able to move through the world unseen. The truth would have disappointed them. Rio had simply returned to his first love, cooking. He traveled through Asia and Europe, working in kitchens from Tokyo to Paris, refining his culinary skills while maintaining the discipline and awareness his combat training had instilled. The precision and focus that had made him legendary in fighting pits now went into creating perfect dishes and running efficient kitchens. His choice of the Nevada desert for his own establishment wasn't random. The open landscape reminded him of Master Chen's lessons about awareness and positioning. The diner's location, while appearing simply convenient for travelers, offered tactical advantages that would have impressed his old teacher. Every aspect of its design and operation reflected the principles he had learned in those years of intense training. Now, as the Shadow Riders' motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot, those hard-earned skills hummed just beneath the surface. Of Rio's quiet exterior, his hands moved steadily, preparing meals with the same focus he'd once brought to combat, while his awareness expanded to track every detail of the developing situation. The techniques of Silent Blade hadn't diminished. They had evolved, finding expression through creation rather than combat. Yet, as the diner's door swung open, Rio knew that some skills once learned must sometimes be used for their original, a purpose. His grip on the kitchen knife shifted subtly, an adjustment so small that even Sarah, watching nervously from behind the counter, wouldn't have noticed it. The same hands that had earned him feared whispers in fighting pits across Asia were about to demonstrate why some legends never truly fade. During his years in the underground circuit, Rio had developed techniques that blended his culinary expertise with combat effectiveness in ways that had never been seen before. His cutting board defense, as some fighters called it, transformed standard food preparation movements into devastating counters. The same motion used to chop vegetables became a disarming technique so subtle that opponents often didn't realize they'd lost their weapon until it clattered to the ground. Master Chen had recognized the unique advantage of Rio's culinary background from their first encounter. Most fighters learn combat first, then try to adapt it to appear normal, he had observed. You have the rare advantage of movements that are already natural, already practiced thousands of times in daily life. This is why your technique appears invisible, because it truly belongs in these ordinary moments. The training sessions often took place in Chen's small restaurant kitchen, where the master would demonstrate how every cooking movement contained potential combat applications. The way a chef turns to reach for ingredients could become a devastating evasion. The motion of wiping down a counter could translate into a sweep that cleared an entire area of threats. Even the simple act of testing a knife's edge had its combat parallel in checking an opponent's defenses. Rio's reputation had grown not just from his victories, but from the way he changed how people thought about knife fighting itself. Traditional martial artists who initially dismissed his cooking-based techniques were forced to reconsider after seeing them in action. His methods proved that true mastery wasn't about learning new movements, but about understanding the combat potential in movements already mastered through thousands of repetitions. The underground circuit had never seen anything like his prep kitchen combination, a series of movements that mimicked the process of preparing a complex dish, but could disarm and disable multiple opponents in seconds. Witnesses described it as watching a chef during dinner rush, except the results left experienced fighters unable to continue. The technique became almost mythical, with many claiming it was impossible to follow, even when watched in slow-motion video. But it was Rio's defensive innovations that truly set him apart. He developed what became known as the chef's guard, a seemingly relaxed stance that disguised lethal readiness behind ordinary kitchen movements. This technique allowed him to maintain combat readiness while appearing completely non-threatening, a skill that would serve him well in his later life running the diner. Master Chen's most valuable lessons weren't about specific techniques, but about understanding the psychology of combat. In the kitchen, he would say, every movement has purpose. Nothing is wasted, nothing is for show. Combat should be the same. This philosophy led Rio to develop his most effective technique, the ability to end conflicts before they began. Through careful positioning and presence alone, the underground circuit never fully understood why Silent Blade's opponents sometimes surrendered without a fight. They couldn't see how Rio's precise positioning and subtle adjustments left them with no viable options for attack. Just as a chef controls their kitchen through careful organization and movement, Rio could control an entire combat situation through seemingly innocent positioning. His time in the circuit had exposed him to every conceivable combat style and situation. He faced military specialists who approached knife fighting with technical precision, street fighters who relied on brutal efficiency, and traditional martial artists who brought centuries of refined technique. Each encounter added to his understanding, showing him how different approaches could be integrated into his unique style. But it was the darker aspects of the underground fighting world that truly shaped his future path. Rio witnessed how violence, even when controlled and regulated, tended to escalate beyond boundaries. He saw skilled fighters pushed into increasingly dangerous situations by gambling debts or criminal obligations. The circuit, which had initially attracted him as a test of skill and discipline, revealed itself as part of a larger system of exploitation. A particularly troubling incident in Hong Kong marked the beginning of his disillusionment. A young fighter, clearly talented but inexperienced, was forced into a match against a notorious killer known for permanently maiming his opponents. Rio's intervention saved the young man's life, but earned him dangerous enemies among the gambling syndicates that controlled many of the fighting venues. This event led to a deeper conversation with Master Chen about the responsibility that came with mastery. The highest skill, Chen told him, lies not in knowing how to fight, but in knowing how to prevent fighting. Your techniques should serve life, not death. These words would guide Rio's later decisions about how to use his abilities. The transition from feared fighter to desert diner cook hadn't been simple. Rio spent years traveling, working in kitchens around the world while avoiding the criminal elements that sought to exploit his skills. He developed techniques to blend his combat awareness with normal life, creating a balanced approach that allowed him to maintain his capabilities without living in a constant state of combat readiness. Choosing the Nevada desert location for his diner had been strategic on multiple levels. The open landscape matched his fighting philosophy. No hidden approaches, no unnecessary complications, everything visible and clear. The diner's design incorporated principles from both restaurant management and tactical defense, creating a space that could serve both purposes without compromising either. Every aspect of the Midnight Grill reflected this dual nature. The kitchen layout optimized both cooking efficiency and defensive positioning. The placement of equipment provided cover while maintaining workflow. Even the lighting was arranged to eliminate blind spots while creating a welcoming atmosphere. For customers, it was exactly the kind of setup Master Chen would have appreciated, practical, efficient, and prepared for any situation. Now, as the Shadow Riders made their entrance, Rio's awareness expanded to encompass every aspect of his carefully crafted environment. His hands maintained their steady food preparation rhythm, while his senses tracked the newcomer's movements, positions, and potential weapons. The skills of Silent Blade hadn't simply gone dormant during his years of cooking. They had integrated fully with his chosen profession, ready to emerge if needed. The sound of heavy boots on the diner's floor brought with it echoes of combat rings in Bangkok and Manila. Rio's movements remained focused on food preparation, but now each motion also measured distances, noted angles, and prepared for potential action. He was no longer just a cook, no longer just a legendary fighter, but something unique that combined both aspects into a new whole. The moment of testing had arrived. Whether the situation would end in violence or peace remained to be seen, but either way, the Shadow Riders were about to learn why some legends persist long after they've supposedly faded into history. The Shadow Riders hadn't always been Nevada's most feared motorcycle club. 5 years ago, they were just another group of weekend warriors playing at being outlaws on the edges of Las Vegas. That changed the day Marcus Razorblade Kent took control, transforming them from social riders into something that made hardened criminals nervous. Kent's background in private military contracting had given him a different vision for what a motorcycle club could become. After 3 tours in global conflict zones, he'd brought home more than just scars and combat experience. He'd developed a systematic approach to territorial control that combined military precision with criminal enterprise. Under his leadership, the Shadow Riders evolved beyond traditional biker gang activities. Their protection rackets operated with corporate efficiency, targeting businesses along major transportation routes to create controlled corridors for their other operations. Their enforcement methods were calculated rather than cruel, designed to establish dominance through precise application of force rather than random violence. The club's inner circle reflected Kent's strategic approach. His second-in-command, Michael Professor Zhang, had left a promising career in business analytics to pursue the outlaw life. Zhang's expertise transformed their criminal enterprises into sophisticated operations that law enforcement struggled to track. He approached territorial expansion like a corporate merger, analyzing potential targets with cold precision. Tonight's visit to the Midnight Grill wasn't random. The diner's location made it a perfect monitoring point for 3 major trucking routes. Their satellite operations in Vegas had identified increasing traffic patterns that suggested someone was moving product through the area without paying their transit fees. The diner's position would give them eyes on every vehicle passing through this sector. The 3 riders who entered the Midnight Grill represented the club's elite enforcement team. Leading them was Derek Switchblade Kent, Marcus's younger brother and former Special Forces operator. His military bearing remained evident despite the leather jacket and club patches. Behind him walked Cooper Icepick Martinez, whose seemingly relaxed posture masked extensive close-quarters combat training. The third member, Thomas Prospect Wilson, was newer. Recently recruited from a private security firm, he was eager to prove himself worthy of full membership. His nervous energy manifested in constant movement, hands never quite still, eyes scanning everything. The others tolerated this because his background in corporate surveillance added valuable skills to their operation. Their appearance had been carefully chosen to project a specific image. The leather jackets bore the Shadow Rider's distinctive emblem, a hooded figure wielding curved blades rendered in deep crimson against black leather. Their boots, despite appearing like standard biker wear, were actually tactical gear modified for motorcycle use. Even their seemingly casual positioning as they entered the diner was calculated to control lines of sight and potential escape routes. The Shadow Rider's expansion into this territory had been methodical. First came surveillance, identifying key businesses and traffic patterns. Then casual visits by regular members, establishing presence while gathering intelligence. Finally, the enforcement team would make their proposition, one that experience had taught them few businesses could refuse. Their reputation had grown through carefully orchestrated examples. When the owner of a truck stop 50 miles south had refused their protection, the response wasn't immediate violence. Instead, they demonstrated their reach by having every delivery driver refuse to stop there for 3 weeks. The message was clear. Cooperation was better than isolation. Zhang's analysis had identified the Midnight Grill as a key strategic location. Its position at the intersection of 3 major routes made it valuable, but it was the diner's reputation among truckers that really caught their attention. Drivers talked, and the Shadow Rider's intelligence network had picked up increasing chatter about the quiet cook whose food drew regular traffic despite the remote location. What their surveillance hadn't revealed was anything unusual about the diner's staff. The young waitress seemed typical of desert truck stops, and their background check on the cook showed nothing more interesting than a string of kitchen jobs across Asia and Europe. The diner's security cameras and lighting appeared standard for a remote location. Though Prospect had noted their unusually effective placement, the club's expansion had been so successful because they did their homework. Before approaching any target, they built detailed profiles and analyzed potential resistance. Their intelligence suggested the Midnight Grill would be a routine acquisition, a small business without significant protection, positioned perfectly. For their needs, Derek Kent led the way to a booth with clear sight lines to both the counter and the main entrance. His movement appeared casual, but maintained tactical awareness developed through years of special operations training. Icepick positioned himself to cover the blind spots, while Prospect's constant scanning provided early warning of any approaching vehicles. The Shadow Rider's standard procedure for acquiring new territory started with a show of force disguised as a business proposition. They would demonstrate their reach, hint at consequences, and offer protection that few could afford to refuse. The approach had worked dozens of times across 3 states, building their empire through strategic pressure rather than brute force. Their intelligence network extended beyond simple surveillance. They maintained contacts in law enforcement, transportation unions, and various criminal organizations. This web of information had helped them avoid major confrontations while expanding their territory. They knew which targets to pressure, which to avoid, and which to approach with more sophisticated methods. The club's evolution under Marcus Kent's leadership had caught the attention of larger criminal enterprises. Their systematic approach to territorial control had earned them both respect and careful observation from established organizations. Some saw them as potential allies, others as future threats, but all acknowledged their effectiveness. Kent's military experience had taught him the value of controlled escalation. The Shadow Riders didn't start with violence. They began with presence, followed by pressure, and only resorted to force when their targets proved uncooperative. This measured approach had helped them avoid the law enforcement attention that plagued more traditional motorcycle gangs. Zhang's analytical skills complemented Kent's tactical experience. He had developed a scoring system for potential targets, considering factors like location value, resistance potential, and strategic importance. The Midnight Grill had scored high on their acquisition metrics, particularly given its potential for monitoring traffic through the area. Their enforcement team's composition reflected this sophisticated approach. Derek's Special Forces background provided tactical expertise, while Icepick's close-quarters combat experience handled direct confrontations. Prospect's corporate security training added modern surveillance capabilities to their traditional intimidation methods. The diner's quiet atmosphere was about to be disrupted by an operation planned with military precision. The Shadow Riders had evolved beyond simple strong-arm tactics into something more dangerous, an organization that combined criminal ambition with professional military expertise and corporate efficiency. As Sarah approached their booth with menus, Derek Kent's trained eye noted every detail of the diner's layout. The kitchen's position relative to the exits, the angle of the counter, the placement of the security cameras, all standard features that seemed somehow more purposeful than usual. His instincts, honed through years of special operations, sensed something his intelligence briefings hadn't revealed. Behind the counter, Rio's hands maintained their steady rhythm of food preparation, each movement precise and controlled. The Shadow Riders were about to learn that some targets aren't what they appear to be, and that their carefully gathered intelligence had missed crucial details about the quiet cook whose legendary past was about to collide with their carefully planned future. The stage was set for a confrontation between two very different kinds of professionals. One group operating with modern military precision and corporate efficiency, the other representing a more ancient and refined understanding of controlled violence. The next few minutes would determine whether the Shadow Riders' expansion plans would continue unchecked, or if they would learn why some legends are whispered about in the fighting pits of Asia. The Shadow Riders' intelligence gathering went beyond simple surveillance. Their network included former intelligence operators who had traded government work for more lucrative criminal enterprises. These specialists had developed a comprehensive system for analyzing potential targets, using methods adapted from military intelligence protocols. Derek Kent's own background in special operations had taught him to recognize subtle signs of resistance capability. Something about the diner's setup triggered his professional instincts. The security cameras, while appearing standard, were positioned with unusual tactical awareness. The kitchen's sightlines suggested someone with combat experience had designed the layout. Even the placement of the tables seemed to create natural channels for controlling movement through the space. Zhang's analytical approach had revolutionized how the club handled territory acquisition. Each target was assigned a threat assessment, score based on multiple factors: strategic value, resistance potential, local connections, and economic importance. The Midnight Grill had scored high on location value, but low on resistance potential, a seemingly perfect combination that now felt increasingly uncertain. Icepick's expertise in close-quarters combat made him particularly sensitive to spatial dynamics. His background included extensive training in military and law enforcement tactical operations before choosing a more profitable path with the Shadow Riders. The diner's layout struck him as oddly familiar, reminiscent of defensive positions he'd encountered during his service years. Prospect's corporate security experience added modern technological awareness to their operation. His constant scanning wasn't just nervous energy. He was conducting real-time threat assessment using techniques developed for high-level executive protection. His tablet, disguised as a normal phone, ran sophisticated surveillance software that analyzed everything from customer patterns to staff movements. The Shadow Riders' expansion strategy had been crafted by Marcus Kent based on his experiences in global conflict zones. He understood that territorial control wasn't just about physical presence. It required a combination of intelligence gathering, psychological operations, and strategic positioning. The club's operations were modeled on military occupation protocols, adapted for criminal enterprise. Their approach to the Midnight Grill followed established procedure. Phase 1, surveillance and intelligence gathering, had been conducted over 3 weeks. Regular members posing as customers had mapped out staff routines, security measures, and customer patterns. Phase 2, initial contact and assessment, was now beginning with the enforcement team's arrival. Zhang's financial analysis of the area had identified increasing traffic patterns that suggested unofficial smuggling operations. The numbers didn't add up. More cargo was moving through the region than official manifests could account for. The diner's position made it perfect for monitoring these discrepancies and potentially tapping into this hidden revenue stream. The club's evolution under Kent's leadership had attracted attention from sophisticated criminal organizations. Traditional motorcycle gangs viewed them with suspicion, considering their corporate efficiency and military precision as somehow unsuited to outlaw culture. But their results spoke for themselves. Systematic expansion across 3 states with minimal law enforcement interference. Derek's tactical training made him particularly aware of defensive positioning. As he settled into the booth, his combat experienced, eyes noted multiple concerning details. The chrome fixtures provided unusual angles of visibility. The kitchen's preparation area seemed designed to allow rapid movement. Even the floor plan suggested careful consideration of approach vectors and escape routes. Icepick's close-quarters combat experience had taught him to read environments for potential weapons and obstacles. The diner's seemingly ordinary setup contained too many perfectly positioned items. Napkin dispensers that could obscure movement, countertops at ideal defensive heights. Even the placement of cooking equipment suggested tactical considerations. Club's intelligence gathering had included background checks on all staff members. Rio's history showed an impressive culinary career across Asia and Europe, but something about the pattern struck Zhang as odd. The movements between locations followed no clear career progression, and there were gaps that their best intelligence couldn't account for. Their enforcement team's composition had been carefully chosen for this operation. Derek's special forces experience provided tactical leadership. Icepick's close-quarters expertise handled direct confrontation, and Prospect's technical skills covered modern security concerns. They represented the evolution of criminal enterprise, professional, efficient, and technically sophisticated. The Shadow Riders' expansion had been so successful because they combined multiple approaches to territorial control. Their protection rackets operated with corporate efficiency. Their enforcement actions followed military protocols, and their intelligence gathering utilized modern technology. This sophisticated approach had let them avoid the attention that more traditional criminal organizations attracted. Zhang's analytical systems had identified patterns in successful territory acquisition. Businesses that initially resisted typically fell into predictable categories, each requiring specific pressure points to ensure cooperation. The Midnight Grill's profile suggested it would respond to demonstration of reach rather than direct force, showing how their influence could affect supply lines and customer traffic. Their standard operating procedure for new acquisitions started with subtle pressure. First came demonstrations of their information-gathering capabilities, casual mentions of delivery schedules, supplier relationships, or staff routines. This was followed by examples of their influence, usually through temporary disruption of normal business operations. Only if these methods failed would they escalate to more direct approaches. Derek's military experience had taught him the value of controlled escalation. The Shadow Riders didn't start with violence. They began with presence, followed by pressure, and only resorted to force when their targets proved uncooperative. This measured approach had helped them avoid the law enforcement attention that plagued more traditional motorcycle gangs. The club's reputation had been carefully cultivated through strategic examples. When resistance was encountered, their response was calculated rather than emotional. They didn't destroy businesses. They isolated them. They didn't threaten individuals. They demonstrated their vulnerability. This sophisticated approach had earned them fear tempered with respect, making their expansion more efficient and less costly. But as Sarah approached their booth with menus, something felt off to Derek's trained instincts. The waitress's movement. Patterns suggested awareness of tactical positioning. The cook's steady food preparation rhythm seemed too precise, too controlled. Even the regular customers' positioning throughout the diner hinted at coordinated placement rather than random seating choices. The Shadow Riders were about to discover that their sophisticated intelligence gathering had missed crucial details. Their corporate efficiency and military precision were about to encounter something older and more refined, a mastery of controlled violence that had been perfected in the fighting pits of Asia and disguised behind the simple facade of a desert. Diner cook. The club's expansion into the region had been preceded by months of careful preparation. Their intelligence network had mapped out every business, every significant player, and every potential source of resistance. They maintained detailed files on local law enforcement response patterns, logging average response times, and patrol routes. This information was constantly updated through a network of informants ranging from tow truck drivers to hotel staff. Zhang's analytical approach extended to psychological profiling of target businesses. He had developed a matrix that categorized owners and staff based on likely responses to pressure. Some required financial incentives, others responded to demonstrations of force, and a select few needed more sophisticated handling. The Midnight Grill's file suggested a straightforward acquisition, a remote business with minimal support structure and standard security measures. The enforcement team's tactical gear reflected their professional approach. Beneath their leather jackets, they wore modern body armor, disguised as standard motorcycle protection. Their boots contained ceramic composite plates rather than steel, allowing them to pass through metal detectors while maintaining protection. Even their seemingly decorative rings and belt buckles were designed as improvised weapons. Derek Kent's Special Forces background had taught him to recognize defensive preparations. The diner's setup was triggering warning signals he hadn't encountered since his military days. The layout reminded him of forward operating bases he'd encountered overseas, ordinary-looking facilities designed to control access and maintain tactical advantage while appearing unremarkable. Icepick's expertise in close-quarters combat made him particularly aware of movement patterns. The waitress's efficient paths through the diner seemed to maintain optimal distance from potential threats while appearing completely natural. The cook's precise movements behind the counter suggested a level of spatial awareness that went beyond normal kitchen safety considerations. Prospect's surveillance technology was cutting-edge, acquired through connections in the corporate security world. His tablet ran pattern recognition software originally designed for counter-terrorism operations, analyzing movement patterns and identifying potential security measures. The program was flagging unusual elements in the diner's setup. Sightlines too perfect, camera coverage too complete, staff movements too coordinated. The Shadow Riders' standard acquisition procedure had been refined through dozens of successful operations. First came the demonstration of intelligence, casual references to delivery schedules or staff routines that proved they'd done their homework. This was followed by examples of influence, subtle disruptions that could be easily escalated. Finally came the official proposition, backed by the implied threat of isolation and economic pressure. Zhang's financial analysis of the region had identified increasing anomalies. Traffic patterns suggested unofficial shipments moving through the area, possibly indicating an unknown organization's presence. The diner's position made it ideal for monitoring these movements, but it also raised questions about why such a strategic location hadn't already been claimed by other criminal enterprises. The club's evolution under Marcus Kent had transformed them into something that straddled multiple worlds. They maintained the outward appearance of a traditional motorcycle club while operating with military precision and corporate efficiency. This combination had made them particularly dangerous, too sophisticated for local law enforcement, but too small to attract federal attention. Derek's tactical assessment of the diner was raising red flags. The kitchen's layout provided perfect coverage of all approaches while maintaining the appearance of ordinary food preparation space. The counter's height and position created ideal defensive positions disguised as normal restaurant fixtures. Even the placement of cleaning supplies suggested consideration of emergency scenarios. Ice Pick's close-quarters combat training had included extensive study of improvised weapons. The diner's seemingly ordinary setup contained too many perfectly positioned items that could serve dual purposes. The kitchen equipment was arranged to allow quick access while maintaining clear lanes of movement. Even the standard cleaning materials were positioned in ways that suggested tactical consideration. The club's intelligence gathering had included extensive background checks on all staff members. Rio's employment history showed a pattern of movement through Asia that coincided with several significant events in the underground fighting circuit. But this connection hadn't been flagged by their analysts. The gaps in his background had been attributed to normal career transitions, rather than potential indicators of a hidden past. Their enforcement team's approach to new territories followed a precise protocol. Initial contact was always made in public spaces, with multiple witnesses present. This reduced the likelihood of immediate violent resistance while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business discussion. The diner's current occupancy level was perfect, enough witnesses to ensure compliance, but not so many as to complicate control of the situation. Zhang's analytical systems had categorized the Midnight Grill as a low-risk, high-value target. Its remote location and apparent lack of protection made it seem vulnerable, while its strategic position made it valuable for monitoring traffic through the region. This combination had placed it high on their acquisition priority list, leading to tonight's enforcement team visit. The Shadow Rider's reputation had been built through careful application of pressure rather than brute force. When the owner of a local gas station had resisted their protection offers, they demonstrated their influence by having credit card processors mysteriously malfunction for a week. The message was clear: cooperation was easier than dealing. With unexplainable business difficulties, Derek's military experience had taught him to trust his instincts. As he scanned the diner's interior, something about the cook's movements caught his attention. The way he handled his knives suggested more than culinary training. There was a fluid efficiency to his motions that reminded Derek of close quarters. Combat specialists he'd worked with during his special forces days. Ice Pick noticed it too, the way the cook maintained perfect awareness of his surroundings while appearing focused on food preparation. Every movement, while seemingly devoted to culinary tasks, kept him in optimal position relative to potential threats. It was the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of combat experience, not kitchen work. Prospect surveillance software was picking up subtle patterns that didn't fit normal restaurant operations. The regular customers' seating choices showed statistical anomalies that suggested coordinated positioning rather than random selection. The staff movements followed patterns more consistent with security protocols than food service routines. As Sarah approached their table, Derek caught a glimpse of the cook's reflection in one of the carefully positioned chrome fixtures. For just a moment, he saw something in the man's posture that sent a chill down his spine, the kind of perfectly controlled readiness he'd last encountered in special operations training. The Shadow Rider's carefully planned acquisition was about to encounter an unexpected variable, one that no amount of corporate efficiency or military precision had prepared them for. Sarah's approach to the Shadow Rider's booth carried none of the nervousness typical of waitresses facing troublesome customers. Her movements maintained the efficient paths Rio had taught her, disguising tactical positioning as a simple food service routine. The leather-clad bikers wouldn't notice how she kept perfect distance for rapid response while never placing herself in a vulnerable position. "Welcome to the Midnight Grill," she said, her voice carrying just the right mix of professional courtesy and desert weariness. "Our special tonight is chicken fried steak with country gravy." The words were standard, but her positioning was precise, maintaining clear lines of sight to both Rio and the diner's exits. Derek Kent accepted the menu with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. His special forces training noted how the waitress had positioned herself slightly off-angle, a stance that appeared casual but would allow quick movement in any direction. "Actually," he said, "we're here to discuss business with the owner." Behind the counter, Rio's knife moved with steady precision through a row of onions. His awareness expanded to encompass every detail of the developing situation, the position of each potential weapon, the location of every patron, the distance, to key defensive points. The same focus that had once let him control entire fighting pits now monitored his carefully prepared battlefield. Ice Pick's attempt to project casual menace was betrayed by the tension in his shoulders. His close-quarters combat experience recognized something in the cook's movements that didn't align with their intelligence reports. Each slice of Rio's knife demonstrated a precision that went beyond culinary expertise, a controlled efficiency that spoke of years of combat training. "Jerry's in the back with invoices," Sarah replied, using one of their prepared signals. The phrase warned Rio that the visitors matched patterns associated with organized criminal activity. "But I can let him know you're here." Her casual gesture toward the kitchen contained encoded meaning. 3 visitors, armed, professional training likely. Prospect's surveillance tablet was picking up unusual readings. The diner's security systems were more sophisticated than their initial assessment had suggested. Hidden cameras covered angles that shouldn't have been possible with the visible equipment, and the electronic signature of the surveillance system suggested military-grade technology disguised as commercial security. Rio's knife techniques shifted subtly as he processed Sarah's warning. His cuts became slightly slower, more deliberate, each motion now serving multiple purposes, continuing food preparation while positioning his tools for potential defensive use. The weight of the kitchen knife felt familiar in his grip, balanced perfectly for either slicing vegetables or more tactical applications. "No rush," Derek said, his voice carrying practiced calm while his tactical assessment continued. "We'll wait." His special forces training had taught him to recognize prepared positions, and something about the diner's layout was triggering combat instincts. The angles of approach, the placement of fixtures, the clear lanes of fire, everything suggested careful defensive preparation disguised as ordinary restaurant design. The diner's regular customers maintained their routines while subtly adjusting their positions. Thomas Green, the trucker who always sat in booth 7, shifted slightly to maintain clear sightlines to the entrance. Mary Rodriguez at the counter angled her coffee cup to better monitor reflections in the chrome napkin dispenser. Each movement appeared natural, while following protocols Rio had carefully established. Ice Pick's close-quarters combat experience was sending warning signals. The cook's kitchen work demonstrated the kind of spatial awareness he'd last seen in special operations training. Each movement, while focused on food preparation, maintained perfect positioning relative to potential threats. It was the kind of unconscious combat readiness that came from years of high-stakes confrontation. "Can I get you gentlemen some coffee while you wait?" Sarah asked, maintaining her role perfectly. The question served multiple purposes. Buying time while assessing their visitors' immediate intentions. Her positioning still kept her at optimal distance, ready to move in any direction while appearing to simply wait for their order. The night air carried a hint of desert coolness through the diner's door as another truck rumbled past on the highway. Rio's awareness tracked the vehicle's sound, while his hands maintained their steady rhythm of food preparation. Years of combat experience had taught him that the preliminaries to violence were often more critical than the conflict itself. Position, preparation, and patience would determine the outcome long before any actual confrontation began. Derek's tactical assessment continued as he pretended to study the menu. The diner's security setup was too perfect. Camera coverage without blind spots, clear lanes of movement disguised as normal paths between tables, multiple exit routes that wouldn't be obvious to casual observation. It suggested the kind of defensive preparation he'd encountered in military installations, trying to appear civilian. "Coffee would be great," he replied, using the moment to study Sarah's movement patterns more carefully. Her efficiency suggested training rather than simple experience, each step precise, each position offering tactical advantages while appearing completely natural. It was the kind of unconscious combat awareness that his special forces instructors had drilled into their students. Prospect surveillance software continued to flag anomalies. The regular customers' seating patterns showed statistical clustering that suggested coordinated positioning rather than random choice. Staff movements followed paths more consistent with defensive protocols than normal food service patterns. Even the ambient noise level demonstrated unusual consistency, as if designed to mask specific frequencies. Rio's knifework maintained its steady rhythm as he monitored the situation through carefully positioned reflective surfaces. His awareness expanded to encompass every detail of his prepared environment, the weight of each potential weapon, the distance to each defensive position, the positioning of every person in his field of influence. The same skills that had made him legendary in combat now served to control his carefully crafted battlefield. The Shadow Riders' enforcement team was beginning to sense that their standard acquisition procedure might need adjustment. Something about the diner's atmosphere suggested more sophisticated preparation than their intelligence had indicated. The calm efficiency of the staff, the precise positioning of every element, the underlying readiness that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. It all pointed to capabilities their background checks hadn't revealed. As Sarah returned with coffee, her movement patterns maintained perfect tactical efficiency while appearing completely natural. Each step, each gesture served multiple purposes, delivering service while maintaining optimal position, assessing threats while appearing to simply do her job. The training Rio had given her merged seamlessly with her waitress duties, creating a performance that concealed combat readiness behind customer service. The night was about to demonstrate that some skills, once mastered, transcend their original context. The same precision that had made Rio legendary in underground fighting pits now expressed itself through the controlled environment of his diner. The Shadow Riders were about to learn that true combat mastery doesn't always announce itself with obvious displays of force. Sometimes it waits quietly, disguised behind the simple act of preparing perfect meals in a desert diner. The coffee service itself became a subtle demonstration of control. Sarah's movement as she poured demonstrated the same fluid efficiency Rio had taught her for defensive maneuvers. Her positioning kept her balanced and ready while appearing completely natural, each gesture calibrated to maintain optimal distance and stance. The simple act of serving coffee had been transformed into an exercise in tactical positioning. Ice. Pick watched the waitress with growing unease. His close-quarters combat experience recognized elements of professional training in her movement patterns. The way she handled the coffee pot suggested familiarity with weapon manipulation, perfect balance, controlled momentum, always oriented for potential defensive use. These weren't skills typically found in desert diner staff. Derek's tactical assessment continued as he added sugar to his coffee. The diner's ambient noise pattern seemed deliberately managed. The gentle hum of kitchen equipment created acoustic masking that would make it difficult to track quiet movement. Even the music, playing softly through ceiling speakers, appeared chosen to cover specific frequency ranges. Prospect's surveillance equipment was detecting more anomalies. The diner's power consumption didn't match standard commercial patterns, suggesting hidden systems running beneath the ordinary facade. Heat signatures indicated equipment that wasn't visible, and the electromagnetic emissions hinted at communication systems more sophisticated than simple restaurant operations would require. The regular customers maintained their careful choreography of normalcy. The retired couple near the window adjusted their positions slightly when another truck passed, maintaining optimal observation angles while appearing to simply enjoy their pie. The solo diner at the counter shifted his coffee cup in a way that improved his view of the new arrival's reflection. Rio's kitchen work continued with methodical precision, each movement serving multiple purposes. The rhythm of his knife work was hypnotic, drawing attention while disguising his constant tactical awareness. His blade techniques, while appearing purely culinary, maintained the same efficiency that had once disarmed trained fighters in underground combat rings. "The chicken fried steak is really popular with our truckers," Sarah mentioned, maintaining their cover dialogue while executing another subtle position shift. "The gravy's made from scratch." Her casual gesture toward the kitchen contained another encoded message. The visitor's body language suggested imminent escalation. Derek noted how the cook's movements never created patterns that could be predicted. Even within the routine of food preparation, there was a calculated randomness to his actions that prevented anticipation of his position at any given moment. It was a technique Derek had last seen demonstrated by close-quarters combat specialists during his special forces training. Icepick's hand moved unconsciously toward the concealed blade in his jacket, a gesture instantly noted by Rio through the reflection in his carefully positioned prep station. The subtle shift in the cook's stance was almost imperceptible, but it ensured clear access to his own carefully prepared countermeasures while never interrupting the steady rhythm of his food preparation. The diner's defensive preparation became more apparent to Derek's trained eye as he continued his assessment. Every surface that appeared decorative served tactical purposes. The chrome trim provided observation angles. The placement of condiment stations created subtle barriers. Even the arrangement of booth seating established clear channels for controlling movement through the space. Prospect surveillance software continued to identify concerning patterns. The regular customers' behaviors showed signs of coordinated training. Subtle communication through positioned objects, synchronized movement patterns disguised as casual dining habits, positioned angles of observation that provided complete coverage of the space. Behind the counter, Rio's awareness expanded to encompass every aspect of his carefully prepared environment. His senses, honed through years of combat experience, tracked each minute detail. The tension in Icepick's shoulders that preceded aggressive movement, the way Derek's hands remained positioned for quick response, the subtle signals passing between the enforcement team members. The weight of Rio's kitchen knife felt familiar in his grip as he continued preparing meals. The blade's balance was perfect for its apparent purpose, but like everything else in his domain, it could serve multiple functions with equal efficiency. Years of combat experience had taught him that the best weapons were often the ones that didn't appear to be weapons at all. Sarah's movement patterns maintained their practiced efficiency as she refreshed coffee cups along the counter. Each step positioned her perfectly for either service or response, her casual waitress routine disguising a complex series of tactical maneuvers. The training Rio had given her merged seamlessly with her duties, creating a performance that concealed combat readiness behind customer service. The night air carried another truck's rumble through the diner's walls as Derek prepared to initiate their standard acquisition procedure. His special forces training had taught him to recognize prepared positions, and everything about the diner's setup suggested sophisticated defensive preparation. The enforcement team was beginning to realize their routine operation might be anything but standard. Rio's knife techniques shifted slightly as he processed the subtle changes in the visitor's posture. His cuts became more deliberate, each motion now serving multiple purposes, continuing food preparation while positioning his tools for potential defensive use. The same precision that had once made him legendary in underground fighting pits now expressed itself through the controlled environment of his diner. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the counter as the situation approached its tipping point. Years of combat experience had taught both Rio and Derek that the moments before conflict were often more crucial than the conflict itself. In these charged seconds, position, preparation, and presence would determine the outcome, long before any actual confrontation began. The Shadow Riders were about to discover that their sophisticated modern approach to intimidation was about to encounter something far older and more refined. Their corporate efficiency and military precision were about to clash with a mastery of controlled violence that had been perfected through decades of real-world application, disguised behind the simple facade of a desert diner cook. Derek Kent's hand completed its journey to his jacket's interior pocket, producing not a weapon, but a business card bearing the Shadow Rider's crimson emblem. The movement was calculated, practiced, a gesture designed to imply threat while maintaining plausible deniability. "I think it's time we spoke with the owner directly," he announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Rio's response came not in words but in movement. His knifework slowed fractionally, each cut now perfectly timed to maintain his awareness of the developing situation. The blade moved with surgical precision through the vegetables on his cutting board, each slice demonstrating the same control that had once left hardened fighters in awe. "That won't be necessary," Sarah replied, her voice steady as she executed another perfectly positioned movement that placed her exactly where Rio's training had indicated she should be. "As I mentioned, Jerry's busy with paperwork." The coded phrase alerted Rio that the enforcement team was showing signs of imminent aggressive action. Icepick made his first mistake. Frustrated by the continued deflection, he stood suddenly, his movement designed to intimidate through swift aggression. His hand dropped to his belt, where a concealed blade waited. "Listen, sweetheart," he began, but got no further. Rio's response was so subtle that even Derek's trained eye almost missed it. A slight adjustment in stance, a minimal shift in his knife grip, and suddenly the entire tactical situation had changed. Without seeming to move from his food preparation, Rio had positioned himself to control every possible angle of approach to his position. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees as combat awareness rippled through both sides. Derek's Special Forces training recognized the shift immediately. What had appeared to be a simple cook had just demonstrated the kind of spatial control he'd last seen in advanced close-quarters combat training. "The gravy really is excellent." Rio spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had once silenced rowdy fighting pits. His knife never stopped its steady rhythm, but now each cut carried the weight of decades of combat experience. "Perhaps you gentlemen should try it before discussing business." Icepick's hand remained frozen halfway to his concealed weapon. Something in Rio's tone, in the precise way he controlled his environment through minimal movement, triggered every combat instinct the enforcer had developed. This was not the response of someone intimidated by their presence. Prospect surveillance equipment was registering unprecedented readings. The cook's movement patterns matched profiles usually associated with high-level combat specialists. His positioning, while appearing casual, demonstrated the kind of tactical awareness that took decades to develop. Sarah continued her practiced movements, each step placing her in perfect position to either assist or respond to threats. The coffee pot in her hand, like everything else in Rio's domain, could transition instantly from utility to weapon. Her casual efficiency masked the hours of training Rio had invested in preparing his staff for exactly this type of situation. The regular customers maintained their carefully coordinated positions. Thomas Green's apparently relaxed posture concealed perfect access to defensive tools Rio had positioned throughout the diner. Mary Rodriguez's attention appeared focused on her meal, while her positioning covered potential blind spots in Rio's field of vision. "Let's be direct," Derek said, his voice level as he assessed their rapidly deteriorating tactical advantage. "This location has become of interest to our organization. We're offering protection services that you'd be wise to consider." The words were standard, but his combat instincts were screaming warnings about the situation. Rio's blade never hesitated in its steady rhythm as he responded. "This establishment already has all the protection it requires." His movements remained focused on food preparation, but now each motion demonstrated the kind of precision that had once left combat veterans in awe. "Though I appreciate the offer, Icepick's combat experience was sending increasingly urgent warnings. The cook's control of his environment exceeded anything the enforcer had encountered outside of professional military training. Even while focused on cooking, the man's positioning suggested complete awareness of every potential angle of attack or defense within his domain. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows as the tension mounted. Derek recognized that their standard acquisition procedure had encountered something far outside their intelligence briefings. The quiet confidence emanating from the kitchen spoke of capabilities that went far beyond normal civilian resistance. Sarah's movements became more precisely calibrated as she sensed the approaching conflict. Her path between tables maintained optimal distance from potential threats while appearing focused on customer service. The coffee pot in her hand, like everything else in Rio's carefully prepared environment, could serve as either utility or weapon, depending on necessity. The weight of Rio's kitchen knife felt familiar in his practiced grip as he continued preparing the evening's meals. The blade's balance was perfect for its apparent purpose, but like everything else in his domain, it could transition instantly from utility to tactical application. Years of combat experience had taught him that the best weapons were the ones hidden in plain sight. Icepick made his second mistake. Frustrated by the quiet confidence in Rio's voice, he took a step toward the kitchen area. "Maybe you're not understanding the situation," he growled, his hand moving again toward his concealed blade. Rio's response was pure artistry. Without appearing to move from his food preparation, he executed a series of micro-adjustments that left Icepick suddenly aware that any aggressive movement would be met with immediate and effective countermeasures. The enforcer's combat experience recognized the technique. It was something he'd last seen demonstrated by close-quarters combat specialists during his military training. "I understand perfectly," Rio replied, his voice carrying the same calm efficiency as his movements. His knife continued its steady work, but now each cut demonstrated the kind of precision that had once left underground fighting champions in awe. "Though I think perhaps you gentlemen don't fully understand your current situation." Derek's tactical assessment shifted rapidly as he processed what he was seeing: the cook's movement patterns, the staff's coordinated positioning, the careful preparation of the environment. Everything suggested they had stumbled into territory controlled by someone with capabilities far beyond their initial intelligence. Assessment. The night air seemed to crackle with tension as both sides maintained their careful facade of normalcy. Rio's mastery, honed through years of combat in some of the world's most dangerous venues, had evolved into something more subtle, but no less deadly. The Shadow Rider's modern approach to intimidation was about to encounter a tradition of controlled violence that dated back generations. Prospect's surveillance equipment registered a sudden shift in the diner's power signature. Hidden systems were activating beneath the commercial facade, their energy patterns suggesting military-grade security measures disguised as ordinary restaurant equipment. The young enforcer's corporate security training recognized protocols that shouldn't exist in a simple roadside establishment. "Your reputation precedes you," Rio continued, his knife maintaining its steady rhythm against the cutting board. "The Shadow Riders have been quiet, efficient in their recent expansion." Each cut was perfectly timed, demonstrating the same precision that had once left Bangkok's most feared fighters hesitating to enter the ring. But efficiency isn't everything. Derek's combat-trained mind was rapidly reassessing their tactical situation. The cook's movement patterns suggested not just military training, but something more refined, the kind of expertise that came from years of actual combat experience. Every motion, while focused on food preparation, maintained perfect defensive positioning while creating subtle barriers to potential attacks. Icepick's frustration mounted as he recognized his loss of tactical advantage. His close-quarters combat experience detected layers of preparation in the diner's setup that their intelligence gathering had completely missed. The chrome fixtures that had seemed decorative now revealed themselves as carefully positioned observation points, allowing the cook to monitor every angle while appearing focused on his work. "We're not asking," Icepick growled, his hand moving again toward his concealed blade. The movement was designed to provoke fear, a technique that had worked countless times during their expansion. But something in Rio's responding stance made him hesitate, combat instincts warning of dangerous miscalculation. Rio's adjustment to Icepick's threat was almost imperceptible. His cutting rhythm never changed, but suddenly his knife work incorporated movements that any experienced fighter would recognize from close-quarters blade training. Each slice demonstrated techniques that could transition instantly from food preparation to combat application. Sarah's position shifted in perfect coordination with Rio's movements, her waitress routine disguising tactical repositioning that Icepick's combat experience recognized from military unit training. The coffee pot in her hand moved through precise arcs that would allow it to serve as either a service tool or improvised weapon, depending on how the situation developed. "Perhaps we should discuss this more privately," Derek suggested, trying to regain control of the increasingly volatile situation. His special forces background was sending urgent warnings about the cook's capabilities. Every movement, every positioned tool, every practiced gesture suggested levels of preparation that went far beyond civilian resistance. "Everything that needs to be said can be said right here," Rio replied, his voice carrying the same calm control that had once quieted entire fighting arenas. His knife skills shifted subtly, incorporating techniques that would be familiar to anyone who had trained in Southeast Asian combat methods. Each cut now demonstrated the kind of precision that had earned him whispered respect in underground fighting circles. The diner's regular customers maintained their carefully coordinated positioning. Thomas Green's casual adjustment of his coffee cup cleared his access to defensive tools hidden within ordinary restaurant fixtures. Mary Rodriguez's apparent focus on her meal disguised perfect awareness of tactical developments, her position ready to support whatever response became necessary. Prospect's Surveillance software was detecting patterns that contradicted every assumption in their intelligence briefings. The staff's movements showed signs of professional training, their coordinated actions suggesting the kind of tactical awareness that usually required military or specialized security background. Even the regular customers demonstrated positioning that indicated practiced response protocols. Ice Pick made his third and most dangerous mistake. Frustrated by his inability to provoke the desired response, he took another step toward the kitchen area. "Listen, old man," he began, reaching for his concealed weapon with the confidence of someone accustomed to dominating confrontations. Rio's response was pure mastery. Without appearing to move from his food preparation, he executed a series of micro-adjustments that left Ice Pick suddenly aware of his profound tactical disadvantage. The enforcer's extensive combat experience recognized the technique. It was something he'd last seen demonstrated by elite close-quarters combat instructors, but never with this level of refined control. "Age," Rio remarked, his knife never hesitating, in its precise rhythm, often brings wisdom about choosing one's battles. His movements incorporated subtle elements of blade work that would be recognizable to anyone who had trained in serious combat techniques, though some lessons must be learned firsthand. Derek's tactical assessment shifted into high alert as he processed what he was witnessing. The cook's control of his environment went beyond military training or security experience. This was the kind of mastery that came from years of actual combat, refined through countless real-world applications. Every aspect of the diner's setup suddenly revealed itself as part of a carefully prepared defensive system. The fluorescent lights cast stark shadows across the counter as the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Years of combat experience had taught both Rio and Derek that these moments before violence erupted were crucial. Position, preparation, and presence would determine the outcome long before any actual conflict began. Sarah's movements became more precisely focused as she sensed the approaching confrontation. Her path between tables maintained perfect tactical positioning while appearing completely natural. The training Rio had given her merged seamlessly with her waitress duties, creating a performance that concealed combat readiness behind customer service. The weight of Rio's kitchen knife felt perfectly balanced in his practiced grip as he continued preparing the evening's meals. The blade's precision was evident in every cut, demonstrating the same control that had once made him legendary in fighting circuits across Asia. Each motion served multiple purposes, continuing food preparation while maintaining perfect defensive positioning. Ice Pick's combat instincts were screaming warnings as he recognized elements of advanced blade work in the cook's seemingly ordinary food preparation. The knife movements incorporated subtle techniques that the enforcer had last seen demonstrated during specialized military training. Each cut contained the potential for instant transition from culinary to combat application. The night air carried another truck's rumble through the diner's walls as the situation approached its critical moment. Rio's awareness expanded to encompass every aspect of his carefully prepared environment, the position of each potential weapon, the location of every patron, the distance to key defensive points. The same focus that had once controlled entire fighting pits now monitored his carefully crafted battlefield. Derek recognized that their standard acquisition procedure had encountered something far outside their operational parameters. The quiet confidence emanating from the kitchen spoke of capabilities that exceeded anything their intelligence gathering had suggested. This wasn't just trained resistance. This was mastery of violence refined to its purest form. The Shadow Riders were about to discover that their sophisticated approach to intimidation had met its match in an older, more refined tradition of combat expertise. Their corporate efficiency and military precision were about to clash with something that went beyond modern tactical training, a mastery of controlled violence that had been perfected through decades of real-world application, disguised behind the simple facade of a desert diner cook. Rio's blade work shifted into what Master Chen had called the autumn pattern, a series of cuts so precise they seemed to flow like falling leaves, each motion containing the potential for instant tactical application. The technique had once caused a Muay Thai champion to forfeit rather than face its deadly efficiency. Now it served to prepare a perfect julienne while maintaining complete tactical control of the kitchen space. Derek's Special Forces experience recognized elements of advanced close-quarters combat in the cook's movements. The knife work incorporated principles he'd seen demonstrated during classified training sessions: economy of motion, perfect balance, instant adaptability. But there was something more, a refined fluidity that went beyond military precision. Our organization can be very helpful to businesses in this area, Derek continued, maintaining their standard approach despite growing tactical concerns. Or very problematic, depending on the situation. The implied threat hung in the air, meeting Rio's quiet competence like waves breaking against stone. Icepick's combat instincts registered increasing warning signals as he observed Rio's response to the threat. The cook's movements demonstrated a level of spatial awareness that exceeded anything in the enforcer's extensive experience. Every motion, while focused on food preparation, maintained perfect defensive positioning while creating subtle barriers to potential attacks. Sarah's coordinated movements reflected months of careful training under Rio's guidance. Her path between tables incorporated elements of Filipino knife-fighting footwork, disguised as simple waitress efficiency. The coffee pot in her hand moved through arcs that mimicked traditional blade techniques, ready to serve either hospitality or defense as needed. The problem with helpful organizations, Rio remarked, his knife never hesitating in its precise rhythm, is that they sometimes forget who really needs the help. His cutting technique shifted subtly, incorporating elements of the silent wind pattern that had once left Bangkok's most feared blade fighters questioning their life choices. Prospect's surveillance equipment detected anomalies that defied their intelligence assessments. The diner's power signature suggested hidden systems far more sophisticated than any restaurant should possess. Heat patterns indicated concealed equipment, while electromagnetic emissions pointed to military-grade security measures disguised as commercial fixtures. The regular customers maintained their carefully choreographed positions with practiced ease. Thomas Green's apparently casual posture incorporated elements of marine combat-ready stance, his hands positioned for instant response while appearing relaxed. Mary Rodriguez's attention seemed focused on her meal while her positioning covered tactical approaches to the kitchen area. "Perhaps you don't understand what we're offering," Icepick growled, his frustration mounting as he recognized his loss of tactical advantage. His hand moved again toward his concealed blade, but Rio's response made him hesitate. The cook's adjustment to the threat was barely perceptible, but devastatingly effective. His knife work incorporated elements of the moon reflection technique, a series of movements so subtle they appeared purely culinary while establishing complete control of the engagement space. Master Chen had taught him this pattern in a hidden courtyard, demonstrating how the most powerful techniques often appeared the most ordinary. Sarah's position shifted in perfect coordination with Rio's movements, her waitress routine disguising tactical repositioning that would have impressed military unit trainers. The coffee pot in her hand moved through precise arcs derived from traditional Filipino weapon forms, its potential as both service tool and defensive implement perfectly balanced. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the counter as Derek processed the deteriorating tactical situation. His Special Forces background recognized signs of sophisticated preparation throughout the diner. The placement of every fixture, the arrangement of each table, the positioning of staff and regular customers, everything suggested levels of defensive preparation that went far beyond civilian resistance. Rio's knife maintained its steady rhythm, as he incorporated elements of the autumn river pattern, a technique so refined it had once caused a Malaysian silent master to bow in respect rather than engage. Each cut demonstrated the same precision that had made him legendary in underground fighting circuits while maintaining perfect defensive positioning. The night air seemed to thicken with tension as Icepick made another aggressive movement toward the kitchen. His combat experience detected something in the cook's response that triggered deep warning instincts, the kind of subtle mastery that experienced fighters learn to fear. "Your organization isn't the first to offer help," Rio observed, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had once silenced entire fighting arenas. His knife-work shifted to incorporate elements of the still water pattern, movements so precise they seemed to bend light and shadow. Nor will it be the last to reconsider that offer. Derek's tactical assessment shifted into high alert as he recognized patterns of advanced combat expertise in the cook's seemingly ordinary movements. The knife-work demonstrated principles he'd last seen during classified close-quarters combat training, but executed with a refinement that spoke of decades of practical application. The diner's defensive preparation revealed itself in layers. To Derek's trained eye, every reflective surface provided tactical observation points, each piece of equipment positioned to serve both utility and defense. Even the acoustic properties of the space had been modified to mask certain frequencies, while enhancing others. Prospect's surveillance software continued to detect patterns that contradicted their intelligence briefings. The staff's movements showed signs of professional training, their coordinated actions suggesting tactical awareness that usually required specialized security background. Even the regular customers demonstrated positioning that indicated practiced response protocols. The weight of Rio's kitchen knife felt perfectly balanced as he continued his precise food preparation. The blade moved through patterns that Master Chen had once demonstrated in a hidden temple courtyard, showing how the highest forms of combat expertise often disguised themselves as ordinary movements. Each cut contained the potential for instant transition from culinary to tactical application. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge as both sides maintained their careful facade of normalcy. Years of combat experience had taught both Rio and Derek that these moments before violence erupted were crucial. Position, preparation, and presence would determine the outcome long before any actual conflict began. The Shadow Riders were about to learn that their modern approach to territorial control had encountered something ancient and refined, a tradition of combat expertise that had been perfected through generations of real-world application. Their corporate efficiency and military precision were about to clash with a mastery of controlled violence that had evolved far beyond simple combat techniques. Icepick's patience finally shattered. His hand dropped to his concealed blade, the movement practiced and swift. Years of close-quarters combat experience had taught him the value of decisive action. The weapon cleared its sheath with professional efficiency, its edge catching the fluorescent light as he moved toward the kitchen. Counter Rio's response happened between heartbeats. The kitchen knife in his hand never stopped its steady rhythm of food preparation, but suddenly every cut incorporated elements of ancient blade techniques. His position shifted fractionally, adjustments so subtle they seemed like natural cooking movements while actually establishing complete control of the engagement space. "That's a mistake," Rio said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm efficiency as his movements. The knife in his hand continued its precise work, but now each motion demonstrated techniques that had once left hardened fighters in awe. His awareness expanded to encompass every aspect of his carefully prepared environment. Derek recognized the shift in combat dynamics instantly. His special forces training detected layers of tactical preparation throughout the diner that their intelligence had completely missed. The cook's positioning, the staff's coordinated movements, the strategic placement of seemingly ordinary objects. Everything suggested sophisticated defensive preparation disguised as normal restaurant operations. Sarah's response was immediate and precise. Her movement patterns, refined through months of Rio's careful instruction, placed her in the perfect position to either assist or neutralize threats. The coffee pot in her hand moved through arcs derived from traditional weapon forms, its potential as both service tool and defensive implement perfectly balanced. Ice Pick's blade work was professional and efficient, incorporating techniques learned through years of military and street experience. His approach combined modern close-quarters combat methods with practical fighting knowledge, but as he closed the distance to the kitchen counter, something in Rio's stance made him hesitate. The cook's knife skills shifted into what Master Chen had called the silent stream, a series of movements so subtle they appeared purely culinary while establishing absolute control of the engagement space. Each cut contained the potential for instant tactical application, demonstrated with the same precision that had once made underground fighting champions reconsider their career choices. Prospect's surveillance equipment registered unprecedented readings as the confrontation escalated. The diner's power signature suggested hidden systems activating beneath its commercial facade. Heat patterns indicated concealed equipment, while electromagnetic emissions pointed to sophisticated security measures disguised as ordinary fixtures. Final warning, Rio stated calmly, his blade never hesitating in its steady rhythm. The knife moved through patterns taught in hidden courtyards and perfected in underground arenas, each motion containing decades of combat expertise disguised as simple food preparation. Reconsider your choices carefully. Ice Pick's combat experience detected something in the cook's movements that triggered deep warning instincts. The knife work incorporated principles he'd last seen, demonstrated during specialized military training, but executed with a refinement that spoke of mastery beyond conventional combat expertise. The regular customers maintained their carefully coordinated positions with practiced ease. Thomas Green's apparently casual posture incorporated elements of defensive readiness, his hands positioned for instant response while appearing relaxed. Mary Rodriguez's attention seemed focused on her meal, while her positioning covered tactical approaches to the kitchen area. Derek's tactical assessment shifted rapidly as he processed what he was witnessing. The cook's control of his environment exceeded anything in their operational experience. Every movement, every positioned tool, every practiced gesture suggested levels of preparation that went far beyond civilian resistance. Ice Pick made his final mistake. Frustrated by the cook's calm confidence, he committed to an aggressive advance. His blade moved in a precise arc, a technique that had served him effectively in countless previous encounters. But this time, something was different. Rio's response was pure artistry. The kitchen knife in his hand completed its current cut with perfect precision, then shifted through a series of movements so subtle they seemed to defy physics. Master Chen's voice echoed in his memory. True mastery appears effortless, like water flowing downhill. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows as decades of combat experience materialized in a single moment. Ice Pick's aggressive advance met techniques perfected through countless real-world applications. His modern military training encountered something older and more refined, combat expertise that had evolved far beyond simple tactical responses. Sarah's coordinated movements complemented Rio's defense perfectly, her position shifting to control potential escape routes while maintaining her waitress appearance. The training Rio had given her merged seamlessly with her duties, creating a performance that concealed tactical efficiency behind customer service. The clash lasted less than 2 seconds. Icepick's blade work was professional and precise, but it encountered something beyond ordinary combat expertise. Rio's response incorporated elements of techniques that had once left Bangkok's most feared fighters questioning their assumptions about armed conflict. Derek watched with professional appreciation as his enforcer's attack was neutralized with almost invisible efficiency. The cook's movements were so subtle that even Derek's trained eye had trouble following the exact sequence. One moment Icepick was advancing with practiced aggression, the next he was completely neutralized. Prospects. Surveillance software struggled to analyze what had just occurred. The cook's movement patterns exceeded anything in their tactical databases. His response combined elements of multiple combat disciplines into something new and refined, demonstrating expertise that went beyond conventional military or security. Training. The weight of Rio's kitchen knife felt perfectly balanced as he completed another precise cut, his food preparation never interrupted by the defensive sequence. The blade moved through patterns taught by masters in hidden dojos, each motion containing the potential for instant tactical application while appearing completely ordinary. Icepick found himself suddenly aware of profound tactical disadvantage. His weapon arm, controlled through techniques he'd never encountered in years of combat training. The cook's grip on his kitchen knife hadn't changed, but somehow, it now dominated every possible angle of engagement. As I was saying, Rio continued calmly, his voice carrying the same quiet efficiency as his movements. Perhaps we should discuss your organization's understanding of protection. His knife maintained its steady food preparation rhythm while holding Icepick in a position that prevented any aggressive response. Derek's Special Forces experience recognized mastery when he saw it. The cook's control of the situation went beyond simple combat expertise. This was the kind of refined violence that came from decades of real-world application. Every aspect of his movement demonstrated principles that Derek had only seen hinted at in advanced close-quarters combat training. The night air seemed to crackle with tension as both sides processed what had just occurred. The Shadow Riders' modern approach to intimidation had encountered something ancient and refined, a tradition of combat expertise that had been perfected through generations of practical application. Their corporate efficiency and military precision had clashed with mastery that went far beyond conventional training. Rio's steady control over Icepick left no room for doubt about the disparity in skill. Icepick, his breath ragged and weapon unpinned, finally realized the gravity of his mistake. He had underestimated the cook, the unassuming diner worker whose every move had bled into the very air they were breathing. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the soft clinking of utensils and the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Sarah, ever the picture of calm, subtly adjusted her posture to ensure there were no escape routes for the intruders. Her coffee pot remained a tool of hospitality, its potential as a weapon no less real than the blade Rio held in perfect control. Derek studied the scene, his mind working in overdrive. He had been in countless situations, but this one felt different. The kind of precision and control Rio exhibited was unlike anything he'd encountered before. This wasn't just a fight. It was a performance, a demonstration of mastery, each move building upon the last. It wasn't about overpowering your opponent. It was about owning the moment and the space. Icepick's grip tightened on his blade as he struggled against the invisible pressure Rio had placed on him. He was skilled, no doubt, but at this moment he felt like a novice in the presence of a true master. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind, but it was too late to retreat now. He had already committed. "You're outmatched," Rio said, his voice as calm as ever. The blade in his hand moved with the precision of a surgeon. his body perfectly still, except for the subtle shifts of his feet, maintaining an unyielding stance. "This won't end the way you think." Icepick's face flushed with a mixture of fury and frustration. He knew he was outclassed, but that was something no one told him before he started this fight. He had only ever believed in force, an unstoppable tide of aggression that could wear down any opponent. But this was something else. Derek was quick to assess the shift in the balance of power. He had seen fighters crumble under the pressure of the kind of refined control Rio exhibited, but it was different when you were facing it firsthand. His tactical mind calculated options, but none of them seemed viable. The cook's movements were too unpredictable, too fluid. Every time he thought he understood the pattern, it evolved. "I suggest you reconsider," Rio added, his voice steady, unwavering. Icepick's eyes narrowed, his pride burning fiercely. He wasn't going to back down, not without a fight. He lunged, his knife aimed with ruthless intent, but Rio's response was instantaneous. The kitchen knife, still in his grasp, moved through the air with terrifying precision, a blur of motion. For a split second, it was as if time itself had slowed. Icepick's attack was expertly intercepted, the edge of Rio's knife grazing his wrist with just enough force to send the blade spinning out of his hand and clattering across the floor. It was a non-lethal strike, executed with such finesse that the enforcer barely registered the pain before his weapon was disarmed. The room seemed to freeze, the only sound the sharp breath escaping Icepick's lungs. Rio's posture hadn't changed. He stood tall, unwavering, his presence commanding the room without a single unnecessary movement. "You've made a very expensive mistake," Rio said, his voice low but carrying the weight of finality. Derek's tactical mind raced as he weighed. His next move, his enforcer was neutralized. They had no leverage left. But then he realized his only option now was to defuse the situation without escalating further. But how could he challenge the calm, deadly certainty that radiated from Rio? He looked at Sarah, her steady gaze following the unfolding moment. Everything about her, the poised grace, the careful control over her surroundings, spoke of deep training. This wasn't just a waitress. This was someone who had been forged in the fires of conflict. There was no escaping the realization. This diner, this simple establishment, was something far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. "Let's talk about your offer," Derek finally said, the words edged with reluctant respect. He was a man who knew when to back down. Rio allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "I thought you'd see the reason." The tension in the air began to dissipate, but the unease remained. Icepick, now unarmed and trembling with the humbling realization of his defeat, could only watch as his boss tried to salvage what was left of their operation. In that moment, it was clear. The Shadow Riders had underestimated not just the diner, but the ancient art of controlled violence that still held sway over the modern world. And Rio, he was a master of it. The room shifted again, the atmosphere thick with the kind of tension only the edge of violence can create. Derek stood still, his mind calculating 1,000 scenarios in the span of seconds. He had the experience, the training, and the skills to navigate out of this. But Rio wasn't just another opponent. He was a force of nature, an embodiment of mastery that Derek had only seen in rare, almost mythical figures. As Icepick silently backed away, nursing the sting in his wrist where Rio's blade had grazed, the cook's eyes never left him. Rio's gaze was steady, but it carried the weight of someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes within the subtle dance of combat. There was a certain peace in his stillness, an awareness of everything and nothing at once. It was the calm before, the storm, but it wasn't a storm of rage. It was the calm of knowing that no one could touch him now. Derek knew that if he didn't act fast, this moment would shift, and he'd be on the wrong side of history. The diner's staff, those seemingly unremarkable individuals who had only moments ago been part of the background, now revealed themselves to be something much more dangerous. Tools, not just of service, but of warfare. Sarah, for one, stood near. The door, her posture as perfect as ever. Her eyes flickered with a quiet intensity, and the coffee pot she held was now as much an extension of her body as the blades Rio wielded. It was clear to Derek that her every move, like Rio's, had been honed through years of practice, years of carefully orchestrated training that disguised itself as something mundane. "You're not the first to try and intimidate us," Rio spoke again, his voice as smooth as his movements, "and you won't be the last. But I'll tell you this, no one will ever walk into this space again without knowing exactly what's waiting. You for them." Derek took a step forward, carefully considering his next words. He had the leverage, the manpower, but none of that mattered here, not in this space where every chair, every plate, every glass seemed to have been placed with the precision of a master tactician. "I'm not here for trouble," Derek said, his voice now losing its earlier edge. He realized with a quiet exhale that any further aggression would be nothing short of suicidal. "We need to talk. Your skills are impressive, but you're outnumbered. You know that, right?" Rio didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the statement directly. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Derek's. "Outnumbered?" Rio's lips curved into a faint smile, one that held no humor, no warmth, only the certainty of a man who had seen and survived more than most could ever imagine. "You think that matters? Numbers are nothing if you can't control the battlefield, and right now this battlefield belongs to me." Derek's mind raced. He knew Rio wasn't just talking about the space around them. He was talking about the way the diner had been set up, about how every person and every object had been meticulously placed to create an environment where Rio's team could control every angle, every escape route, every tactical advantage. It had all been calculated, and Derek had walked straight into it. The regular customers in the diner, seemingly casual in their positions, were now unmistakably part of this intricate web of control. Mary Rodriguez, the woman who had been absorbed in her meal, was no longer just a bystander. Her hand, resting on the edge of her plate, had shifted subtly to the side of her chair, where a concealed weapon lay. Thomas Green, with his relaxed posture, had already calculated the best escape routes, should the need arise. They were all in this together, part of a well-oiled machine that Derek now realized was far beyond his understanding. He had no doubt that the Shadow Riders, in all their corporate might, had underestimated these people, this establishment. "Talk." "Then," Derek finally said, his voice no longer brimming with arrogance. He understood now. "What do you want from us?" Rio's gaze shifted to Sarah for a moment, then back to Derek. It was a brief, almost imperceptible movement. But it wasn't. Lost on Derek, there was something more here than just survival. This wasn't just a fight. It was about power, control, and the balance between old-world techniques and modern dominance. "What we want," Rio said, his voice now taking on a deeper, more contemplative tone, "is to be left alone. We don't need your help. We don't need your organization. What we have here is already more than enough to protect us." Derek's mind struggled to catch up. "Protection from who?" "The ones who think they can buy power," Rio replied, his tone sharp and final. "The ones who think they can intimidate people like us. You came in with your tactics, your corporate threats, and your shiny toys. But you missed the one thing that matters most: respect." Derek felt a ripple of discomfort deep within. Respect was the cornerstone of everything Rio was saying. It wasn't about force. It wasn't about overpowering your enemies. It was about understanding their space, their rules, and their expertise. And Rio, with his perfect execution of every movement, had earned that respect. The silence between them stretched. Derek could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "What happens now?" he asked, finally breaking the stillness. Rio's eyes locked with his, unwavering. "Now," Rio began, his voice as unyielding as the blade he wielded, "you walk out of here, and you tell your superiors that they'll get no business from us. Tell them to stop thinking they can impose their will wherever they choose, because the next time they send someone, they'll leave differently." Derek hesitated, then nodded slowly. He didn't need further explanation. Rio had made his point, loud and clear. The Shadow Riders were not a threat in the conventional sense. They were something deeper, older, and far more dangerous than any intelligence report had ever suggested. As Derek turned and left the diner, he cast a final glance over his shoulder. The staff, the customers, Rio and Sarah were all calm, collected, and in complete control. He couldn't shake the sense that he had just walked away from something that could have torn apart his entire world. And yet he knew that was only the beginning of the story. As the door to the diner closed behind Derek, a sense of finality hung in the air. The light outside felt stark and cold compared to the warmth of the dimly lit interior, where Rio and Sarah stood still, the tension already beginning to melt away into their normal routines. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Inside the diner, Rio finally allowed himself to relax. His knife was once again positioned just so, resting on the cutting board as if nothing had happened. Sarah, maintaining her poised composure, slowly poured a fresh cup of coffee for a regular at the counter. Her every move was precise, calculated, each action disguising the careful awareness she held of every inch of the space around her. She didn't speak for a while, but the silence between them spoke volumes. The encounter with Derek and his men was over, but it had left behind more questions than answers. The Shadow Riders weren't a simple organization, and Rio knew that this confrontation would be far from the last. Still, the diner's defense was flawless. His methods, his teachings, had ensured that. "Do you think they'll come back?" Sarah asked, her voice calm, almost disinterested. But Rio knew her better than that. Beneath her words was an edge of curiosity, and perhaps a touch of anticipation. Rio didn't answer immediately. His hands continued their practiced movements, slicing vegetables with an almost meditative rhythm. His mind, however, was far from the task at hand. "I'm sure they'll be back," he said finally, his voice low but carrying an undeniable certainty. "But when they do, they'll know better than to walk in here expecting an easy win." Sarah paused, her gaze shifting to the door Derek had exited. Through. The quiet hum of the diner felt unusually loud now, as if the whole building was breathing with them. She knew as well as Rio that Derek's words weren't just a diplomatic retreat, they were a warning. Something had shifted in his mind. He wasn't leaving with the same confidence with which he had entered. Their mistake, Rio continued, still focused on his food prep, was not recognizing who they were up against. "This isn't just about the diner or about me. It's about what we've built here, what we've learned." Sarah's eyes flicked toward the regular customers. They seemed oblivious to the intensity of the moment, absorbed in their meals, their chatter a gentle hum against the stillness. But Rio knew they weren't just passers-by. They were part of the intricate web that kept this place running and protected. "You've trained them well," Sarah remarked, her tone shifting slightly. "Each one of them was ready." "That's the point," Rio replied with a small, satisfied nod. "Training doesn't stop. Every day, every action. The lesson is in the details, the way you serve coffee, the way you hold a knife, the way you stand. It's all part of the same system, the same training. If you can control the small things, the big ones won't matter." His words hung in the air for a moment before Sarah spoke again, her voice tinged with a quiet seriousness. "Then what's next? Are we waiting for them to make their move, or are we going after them?" Rio's eyes met hers. For a moment, the distance, Between them seemed to close, the bond of teacher and student more tangible than ever. Sarah had always been the one to press, to push the boundaries of their training. She understood the nature of conflict in ways that most people would never grasp. "For now we wait," Rio said, his voice calm and resolute. "But we don't sit idly. We stay prepared. When the time comes, we'll act, and we'll act decisively." The words carried weight, a silent promise that they would not back down. Not now, not ever. But Rio also knew that while the Shadow Riders had underestimated them this time, it was only a matter of time before they adjusted, and when they did, the real challenge would begin. Behind them, the fluorescent lights flickered ever so slightly. The hum of the diner's machines, the clinking of cutlery, the quiet conversations. It all felt like the calm before the storm. Rio felt it, the shift in the air, the subtle tension that preceded the inevitable. Something was coming, and they would be ready for it. As Sarah finished serving another table, her eyes briefly met Rio's again. She didn't need to speak to understand what was going through his mind. They were already in sync, already anticipating the next move. Derek had walked out, but the Shadow Riders' influence, their reach, had just begun to make ripples. This wasn't a battle won in a moment. It was a battle of patience, of outlasting your opponents until they were too tired to keep fighting. And the diner, Rio and his team, had already learned that lesson. Across town, Derek sat in the back of a sleek black SUV, the dull hum of the engine filling the silence. He rubbed his wrist absent-mindedly, his mind replaying the encounter with Rio again and again. Every detail, every movement, every breath the cook had taken. It was all so deliberate, so beyond what he had expected. He had known Rio was dangerous, but it wasn't until he saw the way the cook controlled the space, the way he commanded every inch of that diner, that Derek realized how deep the problem went. The Shadow Riders had underestimated them, and now they would have to recalibrate, rethink their entire approach. Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the message. It was from his superior. Situation escalating. Prepare for more pressure. Adjust strategy accordingly. He stared at the screen for a moment, his mind turning the words over, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't be as simple as adjusting tactics. Rio and his team weren't just people to overpower. They were something else, an enigma wrapped in layers of protection, precision, and skill. And Derek had just realized how much of a threat that really was. "Ready for the next round?" one of his operatives asked from the front seat, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Derek exhaled, his fingers tightening around the phone. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, at the city unfolding before him. His gut told him the real fight hadn't even begun yet. And when it did, there would be no turning back. "Yeah," Derek finally said, his voice hardening. "Let's see how far they're willing to go." Back at the diner, the calm had returned. But Rio knew the truth. The peace was only temporary. The next round was coming, and this time he would make sure they were ready. The sun had long set, and the diner's neon sign flickered in the night air, casting an eerie glow on the empty street outside. Inside, the atmosphere was almost serene, the quiet hum of the fridge and the clink of plates the only sounds that broke the stillness. But beneath the surface, the tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Rio sat at the counter, his focus sharp as he cleaned a few utensils. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost meditative, but his mind was a whirl of calculated thoughts. Every instinct told him that the Shadow Riders would be back. Derek's retreat had only delayed the inevitable. The question was, how long would they wait before making their next move? Sarah moved between the tables with her usual grace, her every step measured. She had learned more in the past few months than most people would in a lifetime. And though she kept up the appearance of a waitress, her eyes missed nothing. She noticed the subtle shifts in Rio's posture, the tension in his shoulders that betrayed a moment of unease. It wasn't about the fight. She knew he was ready for that. It was the uncertainty of what came next. "Think they'll come tonight?" she asked, breaking the silence. Rio didn't look up immediately. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the knife in his hand. "They'll come when they think they have the advantage," he said quietly, his voice carrying the depth of someone who had spent his life anticipating threats. "And when they do, they'll have no idea what they're walking into." He set the knife down and glanced over at Sarah. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see the readiness in her eyes. She was always ready, always prepared. It was the core of their training, never to allow complacency, even in moments of calm. "Ice pick wasn't the worst they have," Sarah murmured, her voice low, as if considering the next phase of their strategy. "He was experienced but too controlled, predictable." "Predictability is a weakness," Rio agreed, his tone sharp. "They'll send someone who can't be predicted, someone who understands what we're doing here, but they won't understand it fully, not until it's too late." She nodded, wiping down a table in quiet thought. Rio's words were always a few steps ahead of everyone else's, and it was that foresight that kept them in control. Still, she couldn't help but feel a slight thrill at the prospect of facing whatever threat would come next. The challenge, the unpredictability, that was what kept her on edge, what kept her alive. Outside, a black sedan rolled quietly into view, its tinted windows reflecting the pale streetlights. It slowed as it neared the diner, and Rio's senses sharpened. He could feel the presence of the vehicle before he even saw it. It was more than just the sound of the tires against the pavement. It was the feeling of something out of place, the pulse of a storm gathering on the horizon. Sarah paused as the car came to a stop by the curb, her body tensing slightly. Rio made a subtle motion with his hand, signaling her to remain calm, to stay in character. The door to the sedan opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and a tall figure stepped out, their silhouette framed by the streetlights. Rio didn't need to see their face to know they weren't just another enforcer. This was different. The posture, the way they carried themselves, it was a tactical move, someone who had been trained to blend in, to infiltrate, and to strike when the moment was right. The figure walked toward the diner with purpose, their footsteps measured and quiet. They didn't glance toward the windows or make any attempt to appear inconspicuous. They were confident, too confident. Sarah moved fluidly toward the counter, as though nothing were out of the ordinary, her gaze never lingering on the newcomer. Rio's eyes followed the figure as they approached the door, his posture remaining relaxed, but every muscle primed. He didn't move, not yet. Patience was a weapon, and tonight he would let this person think they had the upper hand. The door chimed softly as the figure entered, their gaze sweeping the diner with practiced ease. They took a moment to scan the room, their eyes lingering, briefly on the regulars, before landing on Rio, who continued to clean his utensils with deliberate calm. "Evening," the figure said, their voice low, with just the right amount of cool professionalism to hide their intent. "I'm looking for someone." Rio didn't respond right away. He allowed the silence to stretch, weighing the moment, his fingers still wrapped around the handle of a knife. The figure was good, he could tell, but good wasn't good enough. "I'm not sure you're in the right place," Rio finally said, his voice smooth. "We don't serve your kind here." The figure smiled slightly, a thin, knowing curve of their lips. "That's funny," they said, stepping closer, "because I'm pretty. Sure, I'm in the exact right place, and I think you know exactly who I'm looking for." The air in the diner shifted, thickening with an almost palpable tension. Sarah's movements had slowed imperceptibly, and she leaned a little closer to the counter, watching the figure with silent calculation. "You've underestimated us," Rio continued, his words calm, but carrying the weight of someone who had seen every trick in the book. "Your organization doesn't know what it's up against, and you're going to leave here just like the others." The figure chuckled, a sound that didn't reach their eyes. "You think you have control here? You think because you've got a couple of tricks up your sleeve that it's enough? You're nothing but a cog in a much larger machine." Rio's expression didn't change, but the atmosphere in the diner seemed to grow colder. "It's not about control," he said evenly. "It's about understanding what's really at stake, and you've just walked into a trap." The figure stiffened for just a moment, but it was enough. Rio saw it, the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the brief hesitation. They had walked in expecting to find someone who would crumble under pressure, someone who could be manipulated with ease. They hadn't expected Rio. They hadn't expected this. With a slight shift in posture, Rio slid the knife from the counter, the edge glinting under the fluorescent lights. The movement was so fluid, so casual, it almost looked like nothing more than a chef finishing his work. But it wasn't just any movement. It was a warning, a statement. "I'm not the one you should be worried about," Rio said, his voice a calm whisper as his eyes never left the figure. "But you're about to find out who really controls this space." Before the figure could react, the door to the kitchen swung open, and Sarah moved into position, her expression as unreadable as ever. The game had shifted. The hunt had begun. The figure's eyes darted towards Sarah, momentarily distracted, a crack in their focus that Rio immediately exploited. Without warning, his hand moved, the knife in his grip an extension of his will. The cut was a blur, seemingly casual but precisely aimed, as if he were still preparing a dish. The blade never fully descended, but the point hovered just a fraction of an inch from the figure's throat, its gleam catching the light in a chilling dance. "Careful," Rio murmured, his voice as cool as the blade against their skin. "You wouldn't want to make this mistake twice." The figure froze, their breath catching in a quick, startled gasp. For the first time, the bravado slipped, and Rio saw the subtle shift in their demeanor. An experienced fighter who knew when they were outclassed, when they were in danger of losing control. Their eyes flickered between Rio's unyielding calm and Sarah's poised position behind them. "I didn't think this was going to be so easy," Rio continued, his voice almost conversational, as if they were having a casual chat over coffee. "You're good, no doubt about that, but good doesn't always cut it. Experience does." The figure's hand twitched toward their weapon, but Sarah's movement was faster, fluid, controlled, and deadly. In an instant, she was beside them, her arm securing their wrist in an unyielding grip. A single twist of her body and the figure's arm was locked behind them, the sharp pressure against their shoulder threatening to dislocate the joint. "Nice. Try," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with an icy calm that betrayed none of the effort it took to control the figure. "But if you think this is going to end with you walking away, you're mistaken." The figure growled, a low rumble of frustration. They had expected a quick, clean strike, one of the countless moves they had executed in previous jobs. What they hadn't anticipated was the sheer depth of skill and the layers of tactical awareness surrounding them. The diner wasn't just a place of food, it was a fortress. And Rio, Sarah, and everyone else in the space were a part of a well-oiled machine that knew exactly how to adapt, how to survive. The regulars, the ones who had been quietly enjoying their meals, were now alert, their posture subtly shifting, ready for anything. Thomas Green's eyes had narrowed, his hand discreetly resting just near the waistband of his jacket, where a concealed weapon rested. Mary Rodriguez, who had appeared to be distracted by her food just moments before, now sat with a quiet intensity, her eyes locked on the figure like a hawk, zeroing in on prey. Derek, standing just beyond the counter, watched with an expression that could have been carved from stone. His training, his experience, had already mapped out the next moves. He wasn't worried. Not yet. But the stakes were rising, and he knew the true battle was still ahead. The figure in Rio's grasp stiffened, clearly calculating their options. But Rio wasn't one to offer choices. His knife was still positioned, just an inch from the stranger's throat, the weight of it a reminder that escape was no longer an option. "You're not the first to try this," Rio continued, his tone never faltering, "and you won't be the last. But you will be the last to leave here thinking it was easy." The figure snarled in frustration. "This is just the beginning." They spat, the words a thin veil for the growing panic in their voice. "You think you can stop us, Will?" But Rio was already moving, the speed of his transition from calm to lethal seamless. In one swift motion, the knife withdrew from their throat, but not without leaving its mark, a light warning cut that wouldn't bleed but would linger as a painful reminder. Sarah released her grip on the figure's arm, letting them stumble slightly forward, but she didn't step back. No, she remained in position, watching them closely. The trap had been set. There was no way out now. "You talk too much," Rio muttered, wiping the knife clean with a rag. "Let's see if you're ready for the next phase of the lesson." The figure turned to face him, their eyes burning with the mix of hatred and admiration that only those who had encountered true masters of combat ever understood. They had walked into the diner, expecting to find another weak point in the Shadow Riders' war for control. Another place to conquer. Another group to intimidate. But now they were starting to realize that they were facing something far more dangerous. Not just fighters, but people who had lived and breathed combat for as long as they could remember. And the people they had underestimated were a family. A team that fought not just for survival, but for something more. "You should have stayed in your lane," Sarah said softly, the weight of her words sinking into the figure's bones. The figure hesitated, their mind racing, calculating every possible escape route. But there were no more options. Every path was blocked. Every angle of retreat had already been covered. A sharp breath, then silence. The figure swallowed hard, their confidence beginning to waver. "This is it, isn't it?" they murmured. "This is where it ends." "It is," Rio replied, the finality in his voice clear as day. "For you." There was no grand gesture, no dramatic finish. Instead, Rio's movement was like the final stroke of a brush, completing the painting. With perfect precision, he drew the blade across the figure's path, the motion smooth and almost imperceptible, yet lethal. It wasn't the end of the figure's life, but the end of their will to fight. The invisible pressure that had built between them, that tension built on experience and calculated moves, snapped at once. The figure's knees buckled, and they collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, realization dawning on them too late. Rio turned to Sarah, his expression neutral, the battle already over in his mind. "Clean up," he said simply. "We're not done yet." Sarah nodded, her face a perfect mask of controlled focus as she moved to the back. The danger had been neutralized, for now, but the war wasn't over. The Shadow Riders had learned a hard lesson tonight, but there were always more of them, and Rio knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The finality of the moment hung in the air like the faint scent of sharp spices. Ice, pick, now subdued, and at the mercy of Rio's silent dominance, was a mere shadow of the threat he once posed. His body trembled with the realization that this was a battle he would never win. The shadows in the diner deepened, as if the space itself absorbed the tension, sealing off any possibility of further confrontation. Derek, having watched every moment unfold with the precision of a seasoned operator, stepped forward, his gaze calculating. He hadn't moved during the brief exchange, but now, with the danger diffused, his eyes bore into Ice Pick's subdued form with cold indifference. "Get him out of here," Derek commanded, his voice like the click of a hammer pulling back. There was no need for further words. The message was clear. Without hesitation, two of the regulars, men who had once been part of a network of covert operatives before settling into quieter lives, moved into action. They grabbed Ice Pick, his posture broken, hands restrained, and began dragging him toward the door. The rest of the diner, from the staff to the regulars, returned to their unspoken routine, as though nothing had ever happened. The soft hum of background chatter resumed, the clink of plates and cutlery filling the space once again. "Make sure he doesn't talk," Rio said, his voice carrying a subtle edge as he wiped his blade clean with the same precision he had applied to every movement. "And make sure he knows we're watching." Derek nodded, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He knew that they'd learned their lesson well. The Shadow Riders were no strangers to retribution, but tonight the tables had turned. The information Icepick carried, the mission, the true scope of the threats ahead, would be dealt with in time. There was no rush. This was not a battle they had to win immediately. For now, though, they had won the fight. And in this world, that was all that mattered. The soft clink of the doorbell echoed as Icepick was unceremoniously ejected from the diner, the threat outside now contained. The regulars, as if on cue, resumed their meals, the air thick with the quiet hum of normalcy. Yet there was a difference now, a lingering sense of respect, maybe even awe, for the cooks and the waitstaff, who were no longer just civilians in an ordinary diner. They were combatants in a battle that transcended the simple notion of defense. Rio turned toward the counter, his knife once again poised in the air, as if he were preparing another perfect slice of meat. "Nothing personal," he murmured, his tone almost apologetic. "Just business." As Sarah returned from the back, wiping her hands with a cloth, she caught his eye, a brief but knowing glance passing between them. Together they'd faced down the threat. Together they had protected something more than just a place of business. They had protected a legacy, one that had been quietly honed for generations. Rio's gaze softened ever so slightly. "I think we've earned a drink," he said with a faint smile, his eyes never leaving the diner's dimly lit interior. The subtle suggestion was all Sarah needed to nod in agreement. As the night wore on, the diner settled into a peaceful rhythm once more. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft chatter, the clinking of mugs, everything was back to normal. But to those who had witnessed what happened, nothing about it would ever feel quite the same again. The Shadow Riders had learned an important lesson tonight, and so had Rio and Sarah. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones you don't even have to fight for, because you've already won them long before the battle begins. The quiet after the storm stretched on, but there was something heavier in the air now, an unspoken understanding that the diner wasn't just a safe haven. It was a fortress, a place where warriors disguised themselves as chefs and waitstaff. As Icepick was dragged away, the patrons settled into their meals, their calm demeanor belying the true nature of the place they inhabited. They were more than they appeared, much more. Rio's knife moved once more with practiced ease, slicing through ingredients as though he were crafting another masterpiece rather than preparing for any potential follow-up fight. His calm demeanor hadn't shifted, but there was a tension in his posture, a quiet readiness that always lingered just beneath the surface. Sarah returned to her station, her movements flowing seamlessly as if nothing had happened. But the way she scanned the room, calculating, always calculating, showed that she was on high alert, prepared for whatever might come next. Derek approached the counter, his eyes narrowed as he studied the two of them. His gaze lingered on Rio's knife, his fingers tapping lightly against the worn wood of the countertop. A professional's respect was evident in his silence. "You know," Derek began, his voice low but steady, "I've seen a lot of people come and go, but not many have the kind of precision you two just demonstrated. That was impressive." Rio didn't reply immediately, instead focusing on the final touches of his food preparation. His actions were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. He paused, then finally looked up, his eyes meeting Derek's. There was no arrogance, just quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," Rio said simply, "but we're not done, not by a long shot." Derek's gaze shifted toward the door, then back to the kitchen. He had known this was coming. He had seen the signs, watched the build-up in the shadows, but now, after witnessing the precision of Rio and Sarah, he had a new level of respect for what they had built here. This wasn't just a diner. It was something far more intricate, a hidden node in a network of allies and adversaries that spanned the globe. The Shadow Riders had come here seeking control, but they had underestimated what lay beneath the surface. They hadn't just encountered skilled fighters, they had encountered a network of survivors who had been through it all. Derek let out a long, slow breath, then nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm guessing there's more to this than we've seen," he said quietly. "More than just a few rogue fighters looking for a payday." Rio's expression remained unchanged, but a flicker of something passed through his eyes. Sarah, standing silently by his side, crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze sweeping over the room with a quiet alertness. She was always watching, always prepared. "You're right," Rio answered, his voice firm. "This is bigger than any one group. The Shadow Riders are just the beginning. They're part of something much darker. But we've been preparing for this." Derek raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Preparing? You mean this diner, these people?" "This wasn't just an accident." Rio shook his head slowly, the corner of his lips twitching into a small, knowing smile. "No, this is no accident. We've built something here, something far beyond what anyone expects." He glanced at Sarah, who nodded silently in agreement. "This is a place where everything intersects, old traditions, new tactics, hidden alliances. We're not just here to serve food. We're here to hold the line." A new understanding began to dawn on Derek. This diner was more than it appeared. It was a hub, a base of operations for a far-reaching network, one that had been quietly preparing for something much larger than the petty threats the Shadow Riders represented. And Rio, with his calm demeanor and his deadly skills, wasn't just a chef. He was a leader in something far older and far more dangerous than anyone could have. "Guest, you're not just a cook, are you?" Derek said, his voice dropping to a whisper of realization. Rio met his gaze, a flicker of something fierce behind his eyes. "No," Rio replied, his voice quiet but filled with purpose. "I'm not." The night stretched on, but for Rio, Sarah, and Derek, there was no real sense of peace. The Shadow Riders might have been neutralized, but they were just a single player in a larger game. Whatever lay ahead was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next move. Outside, the night was calm, but the quiet hum of the diner was filled with a new kind of tension, a tension that spoke of battles yet to be fought, of enemies still watching from the darkness. The calm exterior, the mundane conversations, the clink of plates, it all concealed something much deeper, something that was about to rise to the surface. Rio set down his knife with a finality that seemed to echo throughout the room. He wiped his hands on his apron and looked at Sarah, who was already preparing for the next step, her expression determined. "We prepare, we wait, and when the next challenge comes..." Rio's voice trailed off, the weight of his words settling in. "The air will be ready." As the last of the patrons left for the night, the sounds of the diner began to fade, leaving only the hum of quiet determination behind. They knew the battle wasn't over. They knew there would be more threats, more danger, but now they were prepared. They were ready for whatever came next, and when the shadows finally emerged from the dark, they would meet them head-on as a family, a team, a force that would never back down. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.